that we are having on a weekly basis. So this is this week webinar. I kindly ask to the participant to mute their mic, please, because I hear some noise in the background. Okay, thanks for that. So we are really honored and delighted to have Professor Prithwiraj Choudhury here today with us. Rai, if I may, is the Lamry Family Associate Professor at the Harvard Business School, and his research interests are in an area which is very fitting with our research interests here at the GSSI, which is the future of work, which is special interest in the geography of work. Okay, so his studies actually concerned with the geographical mobility or immobility of workers, and therefore I think that the fitting the topic that he actually usually investigates, but also the topic of today's talk, are very much fitting with the GSSI research areas and topics. Okay. As you might have noticed, if you don't know him, Ryan is very much productive, and he has produced terrific papers on very important and then top research journals, and I think it's really an important opportunity for us to hear from his research results. Okay, so having said that, a few words about the rules of the games. As usual, we will let Rai talk for nearly 1 hour, so he will have 1 hour available for his presentation. And during this first hour, if someone has got spotlight, brief questions, really understanding question, is free to raise this question in the Q&A button, not in the chat, please, because in chat we have different messages like I can't hear or I hear some noise. So let us leave the chat for this kind of messages, information. And if there are questions, please write them in the Q&A button, okay? Or if impossible, in the chat. But first best with the Q&A button, okay? And after the first hour, we will then open the floor to more extended questions, and we will let Ray the opportunity to reply to them, okay? Having said that, let me remind you that we are up to record and the webinar. So if some of the attendees or participants is not willing to be recorded, I kindly ask them to leave the room soon. We have before casting on the YouTube, and it can attend, or she can attend the webinar anyhow. Okay. Having said that, I will stop here and I will let the floor to our honorable speaker. Please, Rai, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Montresor, and good afternoon to all of you. So thanks for that kind introduction. My name is Raj Choudhury, and this is a paper with two wonderful colleagues, Jasmina Chauvin, who is an assistant professor at Georgetown, and then Tommy Pan Fang, who is a doctoral student at HBS. And Tommy will be on the market next year. He's a wonderful doctoral student, so I wanted to make a quick plug for Tommy. So this is a really early stage project. This is among the first few times I presented it. So I'm really looking forward to all your questions and suggestions and feedback. But before I do that, I want to share a little bit about my broader agenda, and then maybe I can dive into the paper. So as Professor Montresor said, my research has been focused on this theme of the geography of work. And the central premise there is that geographically distributed work is, of course, on the rise. And that is not only in the case of support centers, but also in the case of R&D centers and knowledge production, with more and more multinational firms globalizing the process of R&D. So I have two graphics here. One shows this phenomenal growth of multinational R&D centers in India, and the left panel shows a similar story in the case of Israel. But of course, we know that China also has this amazing cluster of multinational R&D centers. So truly, over the past 10, 15 years, R&D and knowledge production has become very globalized. So with that context, I've been studying this phenomena of how the geographic mobility of knowledge workers is related to this phenomena of globalizing R&D. So I did my dissertation on this topic, which was published in Organization Science, and I focused on this large R&D center of a multinational in India. And the bottom line finding in that paper is I looked at intra-firm mobility. So when employees move inside the firm from the Indian R&D center to the US headquarters, what is the effect on their productivity? And I found that there was a correlation between mobility and producing patents, but the mechanism was very interesting. So the mechanism related to how traveling just prior to meetings, when the R&D budget was being allocated, when the funds for R&D was being allocated, correlated to higher patenting. So if I was an inventor in India and I was lucky enough, because this travel, as I show in the paper, was quasi-exogenous, if I was lucky enough to go to this US headquarters before these quarterly budget meetings, I came back and I tended to file a patent. I also then looked at this phenomena of ethnic migrant inventors traveling across borders. And this is a paper with another doctoral student, Do-Yoon Kim, which was published in the SMJ, where we looked at how ethnic migrant inventors do two things. They transfer what we call contextual knowledge, knowledge that was locked in some geography, and they transferred that knowledge across the borders. So in this paper, we studied herbal medicine, and we looked at how Chinese and Indian inventors traveling across the borders, joining US firms, were transferring that contextual knowledge of herbal medicine from China and India to the US. But that is the first effect, the transfer of contextual knowledge. The more interesting effect that we document in the paper is what happens when the knowledge is recombined. So there's a recombination effect when the migrant works with locals. And we found that there was a really interesting recombination effect that kicked in once the migrant inventors worked with locals. And the sort of bottom line we had in that paper is if you restrict mobility, geographic mobility, if you restrict migration, you are not only going to restrict the transfer of knowledge across borders, but you're also going to restrict the future recombination of knowledge, the creation of new knowledge that the world had not seen. In that spirit, I also looked at what happens if people move geographically, what happens to their own careers. So in this paper with Shinjini Chattopadhyay, published in Org Science, what I find is that based on a random assignment of Indian bureaucrats, individuals who go to these really challenging locations tend to develop human capital, augment their human capital, and then they are more likely to be promoted faster through the bureaucracy. So geographic mobility, the bottom line, is not only good for knowledge sharing and knowledge production, it's also good for careers. And then, on that line of research, I have also explored quite a bit this phenomena of return migration. So this is a paper that was published in the Journal of Economic Geography, where I looked at what happens when returnees move from the US to India. And I found that not only they are more likely to produce knowledge once they go back, the locals, the local workers who report to them are also likely to produce more knowledge. And the mechanism in this paper, and once again, all of these papers, I'm utilizing quasi-natural experiments. So in this particular paper, there was a random assignment of the locals to either a returnee manager or a non-returnee manager. And what I find or document in this paper is that the returnee acts as a mechanism to transfer knowledge from the US headquarters to the local direct report. So there's almost like a knowledge bridge is being formed when people experience return migration. And the last paper I'll show, and I have more work on this, I just selected a few of the papers. This paper I'm really excited about, and it just got accepted at SMJ. And in this paper, what we are exploring is this phenomena of working from anywhere. So thus far, what I've described to you is geographic mobility, where the worker is moving to the firm location, either to get resources or to just be employed, and what are the effects of productivity effects of that. In working from anywhere, which is the form of remote work, a new form of remote work, the worker is now given the flexibility, the geographic flexibility to live in any location of her choice. So instead of living in the location of the firm, now the worker can live in a town, city, or country of her choice. So while geographic mobility could be thought of as the worker moving to where the work is, work from anywhere, the way I think about it, is work moving to where the worker wants to live. And so we explored this phenomena, this new form of remote work in the US Patent Office. And once again, based on a natural experiment, we document that there was a 4.4% productivity increase when US patent examiners were granted this flexibility. So I'm not going to, in the second hour, we can go through the details of any of these papers if you're interested. And I only brought up these papers because I know that I was told that there's a second hour, and maybe some of these papers might be interesting to any of you. So having said that, let me move on to the paper that I want to present today. But the broader literature relevant for today's paper is that when you geographically distribute R&D, the only way or the primary way you can coordinate that is through intra-firm communication. So there's a long literature here, starting with work by Sumantra Ghoshal, to the Gupta and Govindarajan paper in SMJ, work by Shrikant and Fanish Puranam, and lots of other people have shown that intra-firm communication is extremely important to coordinate geographically distributed work. And also there's work by Chris Foreman and others showing that advances in ICT have drastically reduced communication costs, the monetary communication costs. And that's what we are exactly experiencing today. I'm presenting to you through this new tool called Zoom, and that has drastically reduced communication costs. However, there's also this literature in strategy, and this goes back to work by Pankaj Khemawat, but also Heather Berry has a wonderful paper with Mauro Guillen, and Juan Alcazar and others have written an editorial saying that there are multiple frictions associated with distance. So some of you might remember the CAGE framework of Khemawat, where he talks about the cultural distance, the administrative distance, the geographic distance, and the economic distance. And Berry et al. Expand that into other dimensions of distance, such as institutional distance. However, there's one dimension of distance which is extremely important for distributed work, remote work, but has not been studied empirically, and that is temporal distance. So the distance in time zones between the two distributed workers. So I'm in Boston, East Coast of the US, and it's 10:17, I believe it's 4:17 in Italy, and that temporal distance has not been studied, the effect of that temporal distance on global distributed communication in a globally distributed firm. So that is what we are trying to study here. And we think, and I would love to get your feedback, that this is a foundational contribution, because in the world of distributed work and remote work, time zones can be a very important friction. And what we're trying to estimate causally is probably the first attempt to do so. So here is our research question. To what extent and how does temporal distance affect communication among spatially and temporally distributed collaborators? So I'll give you a preview of the paper, and then of course I'll go through all the sections in depth. So what we do in this paper is we exploit data from a large multinational which is distributed across 48 countries with 253 offices. And to find the effect of temporal distance on intra-firm communication, we exploit a natural experiment. And that experiment relates to daylight savings time. So all of us know what daylight savings time is, but the implication of DST is that it exogenously shifts the overlap time between two offices. So in our setting, collaborators can exogenously gain or lose up to 2 hours of business hour overlap. And what this allows us is to do a difference in difference setting, comparing communication patterns for office pairs that gained or lost business hour overlap to office pairs where the overlap remained unchanged. And why is this helpful? Because if we just ran a correlational analysis of business hour overlap and communication patterns, then that simple correlation might be confounded by other factors, and especially other dimensions of distance. But here we are able to impose office pair fixed effects. So we are able to control for all other dimensions of distance between the office pair and only look at office pairs where the overlap, business hour overlap changes versus doesn't due to this exogenous shock of daylight savings time. And what we then do is, using very rich communication data, we have data on intra-firm communication that happens through email, which is asynchronous communication. We also have intra-firm communication that happens on Skype, which is the synchronous calls and synchronous meetings, and also the instant message chats, which is more synchronous than asynchronous. And we are able to use all these measures to see how temporal distance affects synchronous as well as asynchronous communication patterns. And then finally, we are able to do that for different types of employees. So we look at R&D workers, IT workers, and production workers separately, and I'll theorize why we do that. So what do we find? Just a preview of our results. We find that temporal distance has a large causal effect on volumes of synchronous communication. So we find that gaining 1 to 2 hours, so if the overlap is increased, leads to about 17.6% increase in unscheduled calls on average. We also find that losing 1 to 2 hours when the overlap is reduced leads to a 10.7% decrease in scheduled calls and meetings, and an 8.7% decrease in instant message chats on average. Interestingly, asynchronous communication is not affected. It's not affected by either increase or decrease in business hour overlap. And we find extremely interesting heterogeneous responses. So all the positive responses to increased proximity, temporal proximity, is driven by knowledge workers. by R&D workers and IT workers. So in other words, when there is less overlap between offices, R&D and IT workers don't do anything. They don't shrink their communication time. But when there's an increase in overlap, they increase their synchronous communication. And also what we find is that the negative response is concentrated for production workers. So when there is less overlap between offices, R&D and IT workers don't do anything, but production workers reduce their communication patterns. And the last thing we find is we looked at the timestamp of communication, and we find that knowledge workers, especially R&D workers, are more likely to communicate than production workers after office hours. And there's a whole literature on work-life balance. Many of us take calls after office hours. So I don't think this is super surprising, but we are able to document these effects in great granular levels. So with that, if there are no clarifying questions, I'll talk about the theory for a few minutes, then go to the data and the results.
No questions so far, so you can proceed. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Montresor. So, of course, there's a very rich literature on mediated communication. Many of you would know the paper by Daft and Langle. There's work by Pam Hines and Sarah Keisler, and many others on intra-firm communication or just broadly communication. And one of the main insights from that literature is that the optimal amount, but also the mode of communication is related to the task being performed. So more ambiguous tasks that required convergence on shared meaning and richer communication need different forms of communication than less ambiguous tasks. And I believe the literature theorizes that there's a continuum. So if the task is ambiguous, and what Hines and Keisler calls needs the reduction of equivocality. So equivocality occurs when the information is there, but there is confusion or ambiguity on assigning shared meaning. There, they argue you need richer communication, which is typically achieved through synchronous means. So the way we are doing it right now, face-to-face digitally, or even face-to-face physically, we are able to not only absorb the words that we speak, but also observe the non-verbal cues in our facial expressions. And that helps reduce equivocality. And that is why synchronous communication is needed, where we need the reduction of equivocality. On the other extreme, when the task is unequivocal, there is no ambiguity of shared meaning, but the only thing that is needed to be done is you need to reduce uncertainty. There, it's a pure information transfer mechanism. So you don't need to assign shared meaning. It's just, what is the production plan for next week? Someone will email that production plan. And that kind of a task is more suited for leaner, in contrast to richer communication media. And that kind of a task is better done using asynchronous communication media, such as email. So that is, and there is a whole continuum. So I'm not going to claim that these are two extremes. So of course, a meeting or a digital meeting is going to be more synchronous than email, but instant message chats might be more on the side of synchronous versus asynchronous. So this is really a theoretical continuum. And the other thing that the literature says is that in any tasks, in any collaboration, which is what we are studying here, you need both of these synchronous and asynchronous means of communication, but in different amounts based on whether the task needs reduction of equivocality or the reduction of uncertainty. Now, what we theorize is that temporal distance, the friction of temporal distance, increases the cost of synchronous communication. It doesn't increase the cost of asynchronous communication, because writing an email, I can do it during my office hours. I don't need you to also be in your office hours. But to do a Skype call, or to even send an instant message where I expect you to reply back, then ideally we should both be in our office hours. And if the temporal distance between the two collaborators increases, you are increasing the cost of synchronous communication. So that leads us to our first hypothesis, which is that an increase in temporal distance should reduce the volume of synchronous communication, and flipping that, decrease in temporal distance should increase the volume of synchronous communication. And because I don't need you to be present in your office hours for asynchronous communication, we expect no effect of changes in temporal distance on asynchronous communication. Now, next, we sort of theorize how these average effects would differ for more knowledge-intensive work such as R&D and IT versus production. Of course, there's a vast literature, starting with Bruce Koget's work, with Sandro, and there are many, many papers on these knowledge work scenarios, which are done through impromptu interactions, serendipitous interactions, face-to-face communication. So this, of course, goes back to Tom Allen's work in the 70s, until Christian Catalini's work on the microgeography, and how for knowledge workers, it's very important to have impromptu face-to-face interactions, because you are searching for collaborators, the search costs go down. So that leads us this whole line of theorizing, and I'm just shrinking the theoretical arguments. You can read the detailed argumentation in the paper. But what we, in a sense, say that all else equal, the decrease in temporal distance will increase the volume of synchronous communication more for R&D and IT workers than for production employees. And all else equal, an increase in temporal distance will reduce the volume of synchronous communication less for R&D and IT employees than for production employees. And if I just conceptually drew this out in a very, very toy stylized framework, what this graphic is showing is, let's say this is the overlap between the two workers, and let's assume that these two workers are either in the same office, physical office, or in the same time zone. So the overlap is equal to their office hours. Then the red line is the average utility of working time. The black line is the average utility of leisure. So of course, the utility of leisure is very high in the early hours of the morning, the late hours of night. And what we expect is people to work primarily during the overlap and the office hours and communicate during that time. There might be a little bit of communication after and before office hours, but most of the communication will be done during the common working hours. Now, what if the two employees are distributed, temporally distributed? So they don't share the full 8 or 9 hours overlap. So what we expect, so the middle graphic is showing the utility distribution for knowledge workers who place high utility on synchronous communication. So the utility of work is higher for the middle bar. The red line is higher compared to the extreme right graphic, which is the green line, which is the utility of after office work for production workers. So we expect that knowledge workers, which is the middle bar, the middle panel, would actually keep communicating for longer hours after the end of office compared to production workers. Because for production workers, the utility of having synchronous communication at work is lower than the utility of having synchronous communication at work for knowledge workers. So I should clarify, the red line and the green line is the utility having synchronous communication at work. So given the theorizing that we said, that knowledge work is likely to be more characterized by the presence of equivocality, we expect the utility of synchronous communication to be higher for knowledge workers, and hence we expect them to have more communication after office hours compared to the production workers. So it's just, excuse me, it's just taking our theorizing and trying to present it in a graphical format. So with that, let me move to our data and the descriptive patterns. I'll show you the descriptive patterns first before presenting the causal results. So this is a Fortune 100 multinational company with 253 offices across 48 countries. We have a sample of 12,000 employees, and we have their peer-to-peer communication records for a 12-week period in the fall of 2017. So we know where the employee is, the location, and also the function of the employee. And we have communication minutes, daily minutes, for 3 synchronous media, which is Skype calls, which are scheduled, unscheduled Skype calls, which just happen impromptu, and then the third being instant message chats, and then 1 asynchronous medium, which is email. So that is the data we collected. Now, what is the dependent variable? The dependent variable really is what this firm calls attention minutes. So imagine there's a Skype call between me and 3 people in Italy, and the Skype call goes for 30 minutes. Then in the data, I'll get assigned 30 minutes, and each of the 3 people will be apportioned 10 minutes on the other side. Similarly, for an email or an instant message chat, the company counts the attention minutes, but it might be disproportionate. So maybe the manager sends 20 minutes worth of email, and the direct report only sends 2 minutes worth of email. So it doesn't need to be balanced in either case, for the calls or the chats or the emails. These are undirected graphs. Our main independent variable is the business hour overlap between the 2 offices these workers are. And we are going to aggregate the data to an office pair. So we're going to aggregate all the individual data and create office pair week variables. So our unit of analysis is office pair week. And remember, there are 12 weeks and we have 253 offices. I'll tell you how we get the number of office pairs. But the business hour overlap is simple. It's based on the time zones of the 2 offices. So in this case, if I take Buenos Aires and San Francisco, given the clocks, they have 6 hours of overlap on September 1st. These are the locations of our employees. So they're really globally distributed, which is very good because that creates a lot of variation in time zone distribution. These are just the descriptive flows of synchronous communication. So 80% of the communication is synchronous, which is really interesting. 20% of the communication is asynchronous based on email. And there's a lot of overlap in the synchronous communication flow patterns and the synchronous communication, which sort of validates the point that Heinz and Keisler make, which is every task needs some synchronous and some asynchronous. So it's
sorry,
not.
Can I ask a spotlight question?
Sure.
So those dots where the employees are located are actually subsidiaries of a multinational corporation, are former subsidiaries where they work, or can be another place where they work informally?
No, so these are all employees of the multinational, Professor Montresor. They are working either in the headquarters in the US or all these subsidiaries, okay, field offices, production centers. Yes, so these are only employees of all employees of the single firm.
Yeah, but the question is, they could be there because they had to go there for some reason, for a certain task, or they actually are resident there and they work, permanently there.
I see. Yes. No. So that is true, and they could be temporary mobility. We don't account for that right now. But our theory is agnostic to that, because even if I'm spending a few weeks in Italy, I'm still affected by the temporal distance patterns, like my Italian colleagues, for that period of stay. But you're right. And we could observe that because we know the Active Directory records of these employees. So in future work, we could.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
I'll just make a note. Thank you. So these are the communication summary statistics. So remember, there were 253 offices, which leads to 253 times 252, which is 31,878 office pairs. We only take 6,454 office pairs where there is non-zero communication. So we're dropping the office pairs where there's no communication, because there are many, many office pairs, about 24,000 office pairs where there's no communication ever in these 12 weeks. And it could be because one office is a production and the other one is maybe, I don't know, a sales office in Malaysia, and they don't have to talk to each other ever. So we only look at the 6,454 office pairs where there's non-zero communication. And then each office pair exists in the data set for 12 weeks, which leads to 77,448 office pair week observations. That's our unit of analysis. As you can see from this summary statistics, most of the communication is scheduled calls and meetings on Skype. There is a fair amount of emailing, fair amount of instant message chats, a small amount of unscheduled calls that have not been scheduled ex ante. Just suddenly someone picks up the phone and does a Skype call. But they also track that. And then I've shown the summary statistics for the business hour overlap in the pre-period, in the post-period. And I'll explain how the pre and the post-period works. It's a dynamic pre and post-period. And then some other summary statistics related to the geographic distance. So these are the descriptive patterns. And
sorry, there's another spotlight question, Andrea. Please carry on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering, so the data here are for office pairs, right?
Correct.
So, yeah, I was just wondering about the magnitude of this phenomenon as compared, for instance, of within office communication. Because I was thinking about the nature of this communication that you're looking at between offices. We don't really know whether these teams work on same projects, common things. In theory, considering increasing returns within firms, especially for knowledge-producing functions, I would tend to believe that teams operating across temporal distance may represent a tiny share of within firm communication, because knowledge is produced in teams that co-locate. So I was wondering whether there's any way of signaling the magnitude of this office pair communication as compared to within office communication.
That's a great point. No, we have not looked at it. So that's something we can absolutely do. So comparing these summary stats to inside the office, because we can also observe that. Yeah, I'll make a note. Thank you so much. That's a great point. Yeah, so it was not relevant for our theory, because our theory is about the frictions of temporal distance, but I totally understand your point. It'll be a very nice sort of summary stat to compare against. Thank you. So these are the descriptive patterns. And once again, I use this as a straw man to say, if we didn't have the ability to exploit daylight savings, then these would be the correlational results we would present. And this is, of course, confounded by where the firm decides to set up offices and where the temporal distance is correlated to other dimensions of distance, such as cultural distance, geographic distance, institutional distance. But I'll just show you the raw patterns. So it seems that there is a positive correlation between business hour overlap. As the overlap increases, scheduled calls and meetings go up. The unscheduled calls and meetings also go up. The correlation is weaker. There doesn't seem to be a very strong correlation either way for instant message chats. And then email seems to be going down. But once again, I don't spend too much time on this because these are simple correlational patterns, and there's a lot of econometric endogeneity going on here. So then let me talk about the empirical strategy. So as I've mentioned before, it's based on this natural experiment where office pairs are exogenously experiencing a change in business hour overlap because of daylight savings. So just to give you an example, Houston in this time period is moving the clock back by 30 minutes or by 1 hour. Sao Paulo is moving it ahead. Bangalore, unchanged. So there are many offices where there's no daylight savings effect. And so the timeline of the event is the week one of our study is 10 September. Daylight savings starts as early in 24th September in New Zealand, followed by Australia, followed by Brazil, and then Europe. It ends, as you would know, 29th October. In North America, it ends 5th November. And so that creates a dynamic treatment effect between office pairs. And then our study really ends on December 3rd. So the treatment condition is that the office pair experienced any change in any direction on business hour overlap. So in this example, the San Francisco Buenos Aires, the business hour overlap was 6 hours on September 1st. On November 6th, it becomes 5 hours. And so this is the distribution of treatment. So as I said, with New Zealand and Australia kicking in early, the red bar, the red shaded part of the bar is the percentage of office pairs which experience a decrease in business hour overlap. The green part of the bar is the fraction of office pairs that experience an increase in overlap, and the gray bar is no change. So by the end of our study, or by week 9 actually, 40% of our office pairs have been treated in either a positive or a negative direction. So our specification is essentially measuring communication, that's the dependent variable, and we measure total communication, we measure synchronous communication and asynchronous communication, all in the minutes, the tension minutes. And we use a gravity-style quasi-maximum likelihood Poisson model, and we use the model that Korea has proposed in the 2019 paper, which is especially very robust for high-dimensional fixed effects because we have office pair fixed effects. And then the main treatment variable is whether or not the office pair, a dummy for whether or not the office pair experiences a change in distance. So it's really a dummy. We're not doing it as a continuous measure, and interacted with the post variable, which is when is the treatment happening for that office pair. So post is not a uniform post. It depends on when that office pair is shocked by the daylight savings. And we have weak fixed effects, office pair fixed effects. So this is a high dimensional fixed effects model. And I want to say something up front. We have also tried OLS, which is of course much easier to interpret, but I'm going to show you the results from the gravity style quasi-maximum likelihood Poisson models. So what do we find? We find that when there is an increase in distance, we find that scheduled calls go down and instant message chats go down on average, and total communication goes down as well. Email is unaffected. And I've told you the marginal effects up front. We find that when there's a decrease in business hour overlap, once again, email is unaffected, and unscheduled calls goes up. So this was really interesting. So when there was more overlap between the offices, they were planning more serendipitous unscheduled calls. But these are just the average effects. And now I'm going to show you the the heterogeneous effects by work task. But before that, some of you might have a question about pre-trends. This was beautiful. We did not find any pre-trends, so this was really nice. And so what do we find in terms of the effects for employee function? So let me first show you the R&D and the IT, and then I'll show you the production. So if there was an increased distance, so if there was less overlap, what we found is that R&D didn't change communication. It did not reduce communication, neither did it increase communication. But it did not importantly reduce communication. And IT also did not reduce communication. There was a marginal effect for instant message chats, but with certain models, that significance is gone. With decreased distance, we find R&D workers do more unscheduled calls. So this effect I showed you here for the unscheduled calls is driven by R&D workers. They tend to have more serendipitous unscheduled calls. We find that when there's a decreased distance, more overlap, the IT workers do more scheduled meetings. And so all the positive changes to decreased distance is being driven by either R&D or IT. Let's look at production. First, let's look at the bottom panel. When there is a decreased distance, which means more overlap, they don't react positively. Unlike R&D, unlike IT, they do not increase scheduled or unscheduled calls. However, when there is a decrease of distance, which is the top panel, so now I'm looking at productions, so it's the top right box. When there's a increased temporal distance, which is less overlap, they reduce scheduled meetings. So just to say this again, when there is increased temporal distance, there's a negative effect coming from production workers. And where there's a decreased temporal distance, there is an increased positive effect from R&D and IT workers. So this table, these two tables were validating our average effects, which is hypothesis 1. And these more task level regressions are validating our hypothesis 2, which is that R&D and IT workers would increase synchronous communication when there's reduced temporal distance compared to production workers, and would not reduce communication when there is more distance compared to production workers. And we have done, so we can of course do more. It's still an early stage project, but we have done quite a bit of robustness. So one concern was, how does the Thanksgiving week in the US affect our results? So we dropped that week. Everything stays robust. We use different definitions of business hour overlap. So instead of saying 8 to 6, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., we did 8 to 5, 9 to 5, 9 to 6, everything stays robust. We did a post-period robustness, which is, there was a very interesting thing where some office pairs got treated for 1 week and then got treated back to the original levels. And this actually happened for Italy and the US, because they moved their clocks, I think, relatively in succession. So we dropped those office pairs, which have been counted in the counterfactual office pairs for our analysis, but they were really treated for 1 week. But then since the treatment didn't stick, they got relegated to counterfactual. So we dropped those office pairs. Then we Winsorized the data. We excluded very small amounts of communication between office pairs, or dropped meetings with many participants. So we try to slice and dice the data, and all these effects stay robust. So I think I have about 10 or 15 minutes left. So I'm going to talk about the mechanism. So the mechanism really...
Still have 10 minutes time. Yes, please. There was a question, sorry for having interrupted you. I don't know whether, Andrea, you like to pose your question right now, or you like to move a question at the end of the presentation. Was it Andrea? No, who actually was it? Yeah, no, yeah, Andrea Belmartino. You like to pose your question now or afterwards? Andrea, can you talk? Are you entitled to talk? I'm not sure.
Yes,
You can,
Can
yeah.
you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes, for me the same. I don't know, up to the presenter.
Maybe that we have interrupted the flow, so you might pose the question afterwards, I
No.
think. Okay.
Oh. So I'll keep going. So the analysis of the mechanism. So what we now did is we have established the average effects and the average effects by task. Now we are looking at this mechanism based on the time stamp of the communication. So for every communication record, there's a timestamp, and we are trying to see whether communication is being shifted when temporal distance is changing. Is communication being shifted to after office hours, and by which kinds of workers? So just to give you a sense, let's take our San Francisco Buenos Aires example with a 6-hour overlap on 1st September. What we assume is that there is a different measure of inside business hour and outside business hour for different types of communication. So if there's a scheduled call or an unscheduled call, so if there's a Skype call, we assume that the inside business hour is really the same as the overlap, the 6 hours overlap, because you need to be in your business hour, I need to be in my business hour, and then we can have a call. However, for emails, it is taking the outer bounds of the work hours, because for email, both of us don't need to be in our business hours. So we look at when San Francisco starts the business hours and when Buenos Aires ends. So it's a slightly different definition of what is inside versus outside business hours based on the kind of communication. But what we're doing is for every communication record, which is literally millions of records, we are assigning the timestamp and converting it to inside business hour communication versus outside business hour communication. So I'm going to show you two stylized results that came out of this analysis. So this is the first analysis, which looks at what is the y-axis here is the share of communication, any communication, synchronous plus asynchronous, that happens outside of business hours. So that's the y-axis. How much is happening outside business hours? The x-axis is the temporal distance and this is, by the way, at the individual level now, not at the office pair. So for each individual, what is the average temporal distance for every person that I communicate with? We call that the person's team. And so what we find is that as the average temporal distance of the person's team increases, there is more and more communication happening outside of business hours, but it's happening disproportionately more for R&D workers, which is the red line, compared to the non-R&D workers. So in other words, for R&D workers working with more distributed, temporally distributed teams, they are shifting more and more of their communication outside of business hours compared to non-R&D workers. But for both, there is this other similar effect, which is the more is the temporal distance for my team, I'm doing more communication outside of business hours. Then we looked at these effects by employee function. And so these are slightly complicated regressions, so I'll go slowly here. So here, notice that the number of observations have increased in some of the specifications to 6.8 million, because now it's not based on office pairs, it's based on employee pairs. So we still have the benefit of employee pairs being randomly shocked by daylight savings, but we're doing this analysis at employee pairs. And what we find is that, first of all, whatever effects we got at the office pair level is replicated at the employee pair level, which gave us a lot of confidence in our results. So, but what we find is that, the paper has the average effects by employee pairs. I'm showing you the effects broken down by employee type. So let's go through it slowly. So when there's, and I'll just talk about so maybe I'll talk about both. When there's an increased distance, when there is less office hour overlap, let's look at what R&D workers do, which is model 1A. They don't, there's no effect on their inside business hour communication or outside business hour communication. When there's an increased distance, less overlap, IT workers reduce their inside business hour communication, which is column 2A, but they overcompensate by increasing outside business hour communication, which is column 6A. And production workers reduce their communication inside business hours, model 3A, and there's no effect outside business hours, which is very consistent with our hypothesis 2A. And when we look at the bottom panel, which is decreased distance, what we find is that when there's decreased distance, more office hour overlap, then R&D workers increase their communication inside business hours, no effect outside business hours. IT workers increase their communication inside business hours, no effect outside business hours. And production workers do not change, do not increase communication either inside or outside business hours. So this is once again doing two things for us. It's validating our office pair results at the employee pair, and it's validating both hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 at the employee pair level compared to the office pair level. So I'm not going to show the leisure time. That's very consistent with what this graph I showed you, because I have like 4 minutes left. So let me conclude in my last 4 minutes. So to our knowledge, this paper represents the first set of causal estimates of how temporal distance affects intra-firm communication. And why is this important? Once again, going back to work by Sumantra Ghoshal and Gupta and Govindrajan and Fanish Puranam's work, intra-firm communication is really important for the coordination of knowledge work inside the firm. And our results suggest the following insights: that R&D employees place high value on temporal proximity and unscheduled synchronous communication, and production workers are less likely to decrease communication in response to a temporal distance compared to the R&D workers. And so if we think about what are the managerial implications of our findings, this suggests that when to have the follow the sun arrangement. So I briefly talked about the follow the sun arrangement, which is having offices in time zones which are next to each other, versus when to organize work in a north-south direction. So think about how globally distributed work could be done in a north-south direction versus in an east-west direction. And our findings suggest that maybe, and we're not claiming generalizable insights based on one study, but it's at least suggesting that maybe for R&D, you can do it more in a north-south fashion. So I'll give you an example. So of course, we know Silicon Valley is an R&D hub, but what's really interestingly happening over the past decade is that Vancouver and of course Seattle have developed as big hubs. And the advantage here is that though these locations are geographically far away, they are in the same time zone. So the business hour overlap is really the full time I work. And so maybe R&D needs to be organized in a north-south corridor, and maybe production or help desks or tasks which have less ambiguity and require less reduction of equivocality can be organized in an east-west direction. So that is sort of where I want to end today's talk, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prithwiraj. I'm personally fascinated by this work. It was really brilliant. I mean, the idea of temporal distance, I think, is really an important one. And actually, it was the very first time that I had a study on that dimension of distance and proximity. And I think is a dimension of proximity on which we should actually concentrate and work, because as you show in your work is very important. It's got a lot of implication, and also the empirical part of the paper is really very sophisticated. This quasi-experiment is really brilliant. So I was really fascinated by the beauty and interesting of this work. So having said that, now I'm ready to collect questions. I will say, first of all, about this paper, and then if we have some spare time, also on the other papers that you briefly present in the initial part of your talk, okay? So if I remember, well, there was a question from Andrea Belmartino, who is a PhD student of ours. So Andrea, you wanna raise your question now?
Yes, thank you for the presentation, really interesting. I have two questions. First, if you consider, if it is important to consider productivity, because I was thinking, for example, in the software sector, that the allocation of the team responds for time difference. For example, yeah, the example that you mentioned from San Francisco and Buenos Aires, they also want to have these more working hours continuously. First, this is the first question, and the second one is how you define business hours, because again, in some companies in the software sector, they have this, they are working in the rotating shift and not in the normal one. For example, in Argentina, not all the employees for the company, but for example, the supporting team are working in different hours that is not the 8 to 4. These are the two questions. Thank you.
Sure. So let me respond, Andrea. So thank you for your questions. So I'll respond to your second question first. So this is an oil and gas multinational. So it's more traditional than a software company. So we are helped by that. So our default is to think about business hours from 8 to 6 p.m. local time. But we, as I mentioned in the talk, we use different other robustness checks of business hours. So we used 9 to 5, 8 to 5, and I believe like couple more, and all results stay robust to those different categorizations of business hours. On productivity, I totally agree with you. I would love to study how temporal distance changes affects individual productivity. In this setting, we didn't have the data, and we really wanted to do the first step, which is to study how temporal distance changes affects communication patterns. But you're totally right. I think if that can be studied in the future, I think that will be a really good contribution.
All right, good. Any other question from our virtual floor? Let me see where there are questions. For some reasons, I can't see the Q&A bottom anymore. Let me see. Right. So, yeah, there's a question from Andrea. So, Andrea, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Me again. Yeah, very, very nice presentation. Remaining on the productivity aspect just raised in the previous question, I was wondering whether there's any reason we can think that there's a managerial or organizational strategy to increase productivity in the light of increasing or decreasing temporal distance, in the sense that managers might be concentrating specific activities and collaborations across temporal distance when they know that this decreases. Wouldn't be worth looking at communication across the whole solar year, I don't know, to compare whether there are anticipation effects or this sort of strategic behavior?
No, you're totally right. And so my response is, yes, I think companies do not open offices in abstraction. There's a lot of thought which goes on to where the office is opened in the first place, and then how work is allocated. So what we are helped by is that the daylight savings experiment allows us to control for that, at least to some extent, right? Because we are imposing office pair fixed effects. You might have opened offices for whatever reason, and then work might be distributed for whatever reason. But in that 12-week period, we are exploring how shocks to an office pair affects communication patterns. And the one thing we did validate is that they do not reallocate work for daylight savings, to plan for daylight savings. So that would have been problematic. So we got some qualitative interviews to establish that, you know, people, and there's actually a whole literature in the orgs world about these. So Wanda Orliowski has written about the temporal rhythms of firms and how these routines and these rhythms are very hard to change. So to dynamically change them based on daylight savings, I'm guessing would be very hard, and we validate that. But on productivity, again, I totally agree, Andrea. So the one thing that we have data for is their roles over time, but it's a very short period. So it's 12 weeks, but for 12 weeks, we know from their email title, whether the title changed. And one thought we have had as a team is to look at whether there's any career progression even in the 12-week period. But you know, given that these are very different kinds of workers, there is no single productivity measure which is uniform to all of them. But maybe in future studies, someone can, and even I would be excited to do that, to see whether there is any effect on individual productivity.
Great, thanks.
All right, then we have Ugo Rossi, who's associate professor here at the GSSI, who raised his hand. Ugo, please go ahead.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it. I want to ask, your talk is based on the assumption that synchronous communication is the most efficient form of communications amongst employees, especially in the R&D sector. But I wonder if in that 20% of communication by mail, which is perhaps based more on reflexivity compared to synchronous communication. Because when I write an email, I can think about things I'm writing. So is there a way to find out whether these are qualitatively different communications? And if in terms of corporate strategies, if it's worth in a way incentivizing employees to do more email communication, if there are all these obstacles to synchronous communication, perhaps because email communication is more based on reflexivity rather than instinctual replies, you know, compared to like Skype calls or and the like, you know. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ugo. That's an excellent question. Really, really good question. So I've been thinking about that a lot. And the reason I've been thinking about that is I'm really excited about my research on work from anywhere. So that is where my mind and heart is right now. And in work from anywhere, the companies I've been studying, the cutting edge companies that do work from anywhere, they have a very interesting organizational form where they don't have any physical offices. So the two companies that I've been doing research with are GitLab, which is about 1,300 people, and then Zapier, which is about 400 people, but they don't have any offices, and they are, given that every employee gets to choose where to live, no one is telling them where to live, they have a fair amount of spatial and temporal distribution. And so one way they have tried to address the communication problem is to invest in technologies such as Slack. Now, this company that I just presented the paper based on is a very old school oil and gas multinational company. So they only have Skype, instant message, and email. But it's a really interesting question to say, can new forms of asynchronous communication, such as having a Slack channel or even more cutting edge stuff, really enable employees to mitigate the friction of temporal distance? Because you're totally right. One thing that I've thought about, I've not studied it, but I've collected the data from Zapier on the actual Slack communication. And one idea is to do exactly what you suggest, to see whether communicating asynchronously on Slack allows you to be more thoughtful and introspective on what you're writing. Because on a call, you are reacting in that moment, and maybe there's the whole fast thinking versus slow thinking going on. But I think it's a really interesting agenda for research, and I am totally with you. I think we should study whether they can be a different form, a richer form, as Daft and Langle would call, of Slack communication.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Ugo. Are there any other questions? So if not, no, I would have a question or a comment. I don't know how I like to call it. So please, first of all, I'd like to be reassured about my personal somehow definition of temporal distance. Would you agree in calling this temporal distance the extent to which pairs can share hours of their days? Would it be a reasonable definition of temporal distance? And so, did you understand well? So the extent to which pairs can share hours of their days for communicating. Is that correct?
That's correct. So I would be a little more precise. So to the extent that pairs can share their business hours together. So the business hours could be...
Right. Yeah, because my question was connected to that. Actually, you qualified business hours, right? But we all know the business hours are different, right? So that along the day, you have business hours with different productivity. So, or different, I don't know, willingness to work, or you're more tiring or not, depending on where the business hour is positioned along the day, right? So my first question is whether you intend to disentangle also this aspect in future, and whether this is possible. Okay, so this is the first question. I don't know whether you would like to reply now, and then I'll pose the next one.
So Professor Montresor, just to understand your question, you're saying, would we like to disentangle the gender effect?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And if you do expect to have changes by doing that?
That's a really interesting question. So I'm not part of that literature, so I've not studied gender myself, but I know of work by Leslie Parlow and Nancy Rothbard, who have looked at gender and how men and women face different work-life balance issues. So yes, I would be very intrigued to study that going ahead.
And then I have another question related to what Ugo Rossi mentioned before, the distinction between synchronous and asynchronous mediums of communication, right? So one thing that I'm experimenting myself, but I'm sure it happened to you also, that a lot of people are using a synchronous medium in a synchronous way, like when they, use emails like it was in instant messages, right? Now, I'm not sure whether you can actually distinguish this kind of use of mediums, right, with the info that you have. But it might be that this propensity of using the medium in a non-natural way may be dependent on the job status of the people that you have. Then maybe that R&D and IT, right, might, because of the contents that they need to share, might be more prone to use a synchronous medium in a synchronous way. I don't know whether this might be relevant or could be captured somehow.
It's a really interesting thought, and it is captured partly in the analysis I showed at the end. Maybe I went too fast over that, where we are looking at the employee pair, and we are looking at whether there is a shift in both the synchronous and the asynchronous communication during the shared business hours and outside the shared business hours, right? And for email, we didn't find it. There was no effect. So it suggests that at least with the treatment effects, there is no new pattern that emerges. But once again, the caveat is I'm only focused in treatment effects here, not the average effects across pre and post periods. But your question, I'll think more about it. I think it's a really interesting question.
All right. Okay, so there are two more questions, I think. Does Masoud Ghazi, who is postdoc of ours, Masoud, please go ahead. I think, Ugo, is this a new question or an old one? Because you have your...
Oh, sorry, that was the previous one.
Lower your hand. Okay, so
Okay.
Masoud, go ahead.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for presentation. I really enjoyed your talk. And the results are really interesting. Just a sort of curiosity I have, because I'm working on migration literature, and there is a paper from a colleague of mine that she worked on the miscommunication in language. And as you're, focusing on multinational companies, which are located in different geographical locations, have you observed those low share of unscheduled calls due to lack of communication or lack of understanding? Was it related to that, or just I'm curious to know whether it is related to the language barriers or something like that? Thank you.
No, it's a great question. I've not looked at that, but I would love to look at that. And I'm sure you might know of Sidal Neely's work. She's my colleague at HBS. Yes. On how language affects communication in global teams. It's a great, I think it's an understudied question. As a migration scholar, I can say that we need much more work on how language inhibits communication across borders, but it's a great, and we can run a simple correlation of unscheduled call volumes on language proximity between the two offices.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Masoud. Any other question from the floor? Again, the question now could also move to one of the papers that was presented at the beginning. I don't know whether there are. I might have a curiosity question about one of the papers you referred to at the beginning. That was a paper about ethnic inventors. Am I right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That's my question. It may be I don't know, sort of implication of the work that you have done, and whether you expect that ethnic inventors as knowledge career could affect the regional capacity of diversify their technologies over time. This debate about technological diversification at the regional level, in which there's a certain interest here, and also at the GSSI. And then such interest about which are the determinants, the drivers of this regional capacity to diversify technology over time in order to be resilient, in order to not to get, stop in Lakina situation. So what's your feeling about the role of ethnic inventors in possibly driving this diversification of regional technologies?
It's a great question. And actually, I have a different paper, which I didn't show. It just got published in Research Policy in 2020. It's joint work with Danny Bahar at Brookings and Hillel Rapoport at the Paris School. And so what we did is we looked at a large sample of countries, and we studied the filing of patents in classes where the country was not typically patenting patents previously. And what we find in the paper in a nutshell is that when a country starts filing patents in a certain patent class, there's a very strong correlation that that's being done by migrants who are coming from a country that was very strong in that patent class. So I think the implication of that result is that migrants are indeed shifting knowledge capabilities from one region to a different region. So, you might check that paper. I can send that paper to you if you're interested.
Yeah, okay. Oh, well, I will look at myself. Okay. I think that if there are no more questions...
Sandro, sorry.
There's a sorry, Fabiano, are there questions from YouTube?
No, there are no questions from YouTube. I have just a curiosity.
Please go ahead. Fabiano Compagnucci, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your timely presentation. I was interested, and my curiosity is related to your paper about geography flexibility, and it is related partially with the question of Ugo. So, for example, I don't know if you can anticipate some result. For example, which are the sectors which are more affected by this kind of process? You told us that it's not about the traditional sector, but I was wondering if there are some specific factors which are most affected by this process. And I was also wondering about the fact that geographic flexibility prevent physical face-to-face contact at all, or however, there is a sort of mixed model, meaning we can stay at home for 5 days a week, and then we meet in the fifth one. And also because this, for instance, has important effects and outcomes in terms of distribution of population. For instance, in Italy, we have a lot of inner areas where people can live with this kind of model. And I don't know if you have some result in terms of territorial distribution of population. Thank you.
No, thank you, Fabiano. So this is a very, it's a question very dear to my heart. And it is multiple papers, that is needed to answer everything you said. But I'll just say a few things. So in terms of research so far, what I found, so my US Patent Office study on geographic flexibility, which just got accepted at SMJ, there the workers were characterized by two things. They were very independent workers. So using Thomson 67, you could say they are characterized by pooled interdependence. And then they were more experienced workers. So you had to be in the patent office for at least 2 years. So they have developed some level of firm-specific and also task-specific human capital. So with those scope conditions, I find that once they move to their preferred geography, the productivity goes up 4.4%. And it's a random assignment of the timing. So there's a negotiation between the patent office and the union of patent examiners. So there was a month-wise quota for how many people could self-select into this program. But my more recent research, which is still very qualitative, and I'm trying to do more empirical work with these firms like GitLab and Zapier, is teaching me that geographic flexibility can be done for all kinds of workers. So for GitLab, their entire C-suite is remote. They don't have any single physical office. So probably the answer is that you need different ways to communicate. You need different ways to codify knowledge. You need different ways to do socialization. And the final point that you mentioned, whether or not there's a hybrid remote model, whether you're going to office for 2 days a week or once every month is the first best. I don't know. So I'm in the middle of an experiment right now in a company in Bangladesh where everyone stopped working in March. And then July, when they started going back, we randomly ran daily lotteries for how many people and who could go back. And so we simulated a hybrid remote model, and we have collected performance data for this period, communication data. So maybe next year I can tell you more about that hybrid remote paper.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much also for this last reply to Fabiano. Any other questions? So Fabiano, there are no questions from YouTube, correct?
No other question. No questions from YouTube.
No question from YouTube, and I think we don't have any other question from Zoom neither. So I think we can stop here. Okay. I think that we have actually have opportunity to listen for an interesting presentation and also have hopefully an interesting debate. I mean, it was really helpful to us and hopefully also to you, Prithwiraj. So I think we can stop here. We thank you a lot for having accepted our invitation to participate to our webinar series. We thank you for having shared your terrific paper with us, and also your interest in the other papers. We wish you all the best, and then we possibly hope to have you here in person in future if things actually get better with COVID. Okay. But for the time being, thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you to everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.